Okay, so welcome back, everybody, and thank you again for being here today with us for our second day of the International Winter School organized by Università Ulm with the support of the Food and Agriculture Organization. So this afternoon, we are going to speak about food security and food safety with Dr. Andrea Cattaneo, who is a senior economist at FAO. Leading the team that produces the State of Food and Agriculture, which is one of FAO's flagships publication. So he has over 25 years of experience in examining economic issues relating to development, food security, and climate change. In recent years, his focus has been on migration, the role of rural or urban linkages in rural transformation and food systems. He previously held positions at the International Food Policy Research Institute, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Woods World Research Center. So before I leave the floor to our guest, I remind you to write your questions in the chat so that he can answer at the end of his presentation. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Paola, and thank you also to you for this opportunity to share some of FAO's work on food security, nutrition, and food safety. So today, I'm going to try and provide a little bit of an overview of the work, some of the work that is done at FAO, with an eye at communication issues. So what I have on this first screen of my presentation is the cover of the 2020 report on food security and nutrition in the world, which is the leading publication in the world on issues of food security. And on the lower right-hand side, the Codex Alimentarius, which is integral to food safety and is a foundation for international standards when it comes to food safety. So without further ado, let me start first on the food security and nutrition side. Let's first of all, an outline, right, in terms of just, I'll start with some introductory remarks on food security and nutrition concepts, then present the most recent estimates based on the SOFI report that I just mentioned. That's kind of the acronym for the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the world. And then focus a little bit on affordability of healthy diets. So going a little bit beyond what is usually considered issues of food security per se or hunger. And then do a little bit of a transition, introduce the basics of food safety and associated information resources. So this is presenting this set of information. I then close the discussion with different communication aspects linked to the themes covered in the presentation. So first of all, let me start with definition of food security. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now that has a lot of information in that definition, and there is a reason because of all the special wording in this definition has a long history. So the first kind of definition of food security came about in the 1970s when there's a worry about food supply in the early 1970s. So the first definition really was focusing on the availability at all times of adequate world food supplies. Now, that was adopted in 1974, but after a while, it was clear that having enough food available in the world did not mean that there were insecure people, because the access of vulnerable populations was not taken into consideration in that definition. So that's when the notion of physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food was introduced. Access. Then as things evolved, so that was a change that was brought in 1983 in the definition, and then as things move forward, the role of nutrition and what people, the intake of people, in terms of not just of calories, but of a more balanced diet, became gradually more important in the debate. So this notion of having nutritious food, but also being able to conduct a healthy life based on accessibility to food. Right? So this is to say that, and this was adopted in 1996. So over a period of 20 years, even the notion of what it means to be food insecure evolved, and the definition evolved with it. So the current definition, as approved in the 1996 World Food Summit, is the one that was in the previous slide. And it really has four main dimensions. And I think these are, they condense, if you want, the somewhat complicated language of that definition. And it is, food has to be physically available, so it has to be present, but then also this notion of access. So it's not enough that food is available in the country, but actually everybody has to have access to that food, which then links it to income and poverty. This notion of nutrition, right? So food utilization is at the core. It's basically commonly understood as the way the body makes the most of various nutrients in food, and so generally it's linked also to hygiene and sanitation, water quality, healthcare. So it is linked to a number of different dimensions that are not just exclusively about the food that is being taken in, but also how it's utilized by the body and how it affects the livelihood of people, the potential to grow, of children, for example. And finally, there was a sentence in the definition, at all times, right? So the notion of stability of these other three dimensions over time is also important, because you can have issues of acute food insecurity that are very confined in time, but nonetheless are very serious for the people who suffer those shocks in terms of having a brief period of lack of access to food or improper utilization because of disease or inability to absorb nutrients. So these four dimensions to food security, I think, have really caught on and have affected how we think about food security and also how we communicate about food security. I think it evolved very much from a situation of just thinking about supply to one about in the 1980s looking at the hungry and people who really were in an extreme chronic situation of hunger. And then it evolved to take into consideration a whole set of people that have difficulty with linked to access to food and a healthy diet that is much broader than what you might think of as hunger in a strict sense, right? So just to kind of give a sense of where the direction we're taking this is that the notion of food security and nutrition has evolved over time, and it started off with this notion of having enough calories, essentially, right, and making sure that people didn't starve, which has been historically a serious problem, right, and it has evolved to understanding, based on an understanding of not just calories, but also nutrients and micronutrients, and in the recent decades, also to this notion of a healthy diet. You might be taking in enough nutrients, but your diet might not be a healthy diet, and that may often be related to the cost of a healthy diet. And that's some of the things that I will discuss later in this presentation. So here too, how you measure this notion of food insecurity has evolved, and it therefore also affects messaging. Now, and as exactly in terms of how we think of the message, there is the SOFI report, which is the one that I'm talking about for a good part of this discussion, that covers both chronic undernourishment, so severe food insecurity, as opposed to looking at so, and these are different extents of the problem, but both quite important. And then there's another important report by the FAO called the Global Food Crisis Report that looks at acute food insecurity in crisis situations. So that is also another different aspect of this problem, very often linked to conflict, civil unrest, and so it's linked to different sets of elements, right? Now, just as our kind of headline messages from the SOFI report, right? And the one, first and foremost, that world hunger is still increasing. So the prevalence of undernourishment is about by 10 million people in 1 year, and nearly 60 million in 5 years. So this is in part due also that we are a growing global population, but it is an indication that we're not tackling the problem at a sufficient rate. Looking beyond hunger, as I mentioned, I mean, it's not just about the people who are hungry in terms of the prevalence of undernourished, but it's also 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe nutrition and sufficient food. So that is a staggering number, right? And looking at why that happens and how to address the problem, how to think of a communication strategy that highlights the issues and the solutions is quite challenging. Based on these two elements, essentially the world is not really on track to eradicate hunger. The number of hungry people, in fact, is projected to be beyond 840 million by 2030. So on top of all this year we've had COVID-19. The SOFI report tried to estimate, along with other institutions, the impact of the pandemic on food security. And the estimate is that in 2020, on top of the numbers that were already reported, 132 million people are added to the list of those hungry in 2020, which is, again, a sobering number, I'd say. So, given the overall situation, the current level of development across the world and different rates of development and population growth, the world is not on track to defeat malnutrition. And as I will show with some of the slides that follow, it is about undernourishment, but also about access to nutritious food and healthy diets. So looking also at issues like obesity, child overweight, which are in fact on the rise throughout the world. So just to kind of go a little bit more in depth on the prevalence of undernourishment, which is really the measurement of hunger among the different indicators that are available for these different aspects of food security and nutrition. We see that there was a kind of declining trend, and then from 2014 onwards, in fact, the number of people affected by hunger has been slowly on the rise, and that's very worrisome. So current estimates are nearly 690 million people are hungry. That's 8.9% of the world population, and it's a bit clearly uneven throughout the world, right? And so, for example, we have that the majority of the world's undernourished are in Asia, and that's about 380 million people. So that's over half of the undernourished are in Asia. And we have more than 250 million living in Africa, where the number of undernourished is growing faster than many of the regions of the world. So, and this brings us to the composition of undernourishment. as we move forward. So on the left, we have the composition today in 2019, so the most recent estimates. And we have, therefore, that Asia has the most undernourished. But as we move towards 2030 and differential kind of projections for economic development and population growth, the lion's share of the undernourished will be in Africa. And that makes us also envision the challenges that Africa will face and think about how they might be addressed. So, moving along with this notion of how the food security and how we think about it has evolved. A lot of it has to do with the cost also of healthy diets. So it's the issue of food security. It's beyond hunger, and the analysis of the 2020 SOFI report shows that healthy diets cost about 60% more than diets that only meet the requirements for essential nutrients. And in fact, they are estimated to be an average 5 times more expensive than diets that have only dietary energy needs. So one thing is avoiding hunger, so basic energy needs, right? And but if you want to have a healthy diet, you have to, on average, spend 5 times more. And so that means that people that are borderline hungry but manage to avoid being hungry are still very far from having a diet that leads to a healthy life and therefore to better lives in general, right? And so the cost of a healthy diet is in fact higher than the international poverty line. So, which is at about $1.90 purchasing power per day. This means that healthy diets are beyond the reach of those living in poverty or just above poverty. And, again, it shows how far we have to go. And as I was saying, food insecurity is about more than hunger. And when you factor in the people who are moderately food insecure, so this is in some way that one of those dimensions is missing, either stability or they don't fall in this kind of severe category. That brings a number of people who are food insecure up to 2 billion people. So that's nearly 1/3 of the global population. So the point here is that 2 billion people in the world do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. So this is a little bit beyond the hunger captured by prevalence of undernourishment, which is the measure that I was showing before, but it really does get to the fact that it's more than just undernourishment. When you start looking at the stability and the nutrients that people have access to, it's a much broader share of the population that is affected. So this kind of brings to the general notion that we need to do more to meet these challenges, right? It's key to the success to draw people's access not only to food, but to nutritious food in terms of for people being able to, children be able to go to school and learn and be able to lead kind of constructive lives and be able to go to work and a number of things that very often, when you don't have access on a regular basis to nutritious food, become much more challenging and also more subject to disease. So this notion of how you transform a food system so that you address the problem of these millions of people not being able to afford healthy diets. And this number, and this graph, I think is very interesting because at least when I first saw it, I didn't know this directly, but it somewhat surprised me, and that is that. So first of all, on the vertical, you have the prevalence of undernourishment. So this is the standard measure of hunger. So the higher the number, the bigger proportion of the population that is undernourished. And on the horizontal axis, you have the unaffordability of the diet. So how much, given the income in the country, how far are you from being able to afford a healthy diet? And I think what emerges when you see those different colors, right? In the purple, you have the low-income countries, so that have both a high prevalence of undernourishment, and on top of that, also the unaffordability of a healthy diet. So that in the upper right corner, you have countries that are that in a sense have a dual problem. First of all, many people are hungry, but also many people who cannot afford a healthy diet. And as countries become richer, the proportion of those who do not have access to a healthy diet clearly goes down, as well as clearly the prevalence of undernourishment, which really is an expression of hunger, and therefore usually in higher income countries it's less of an issue. But it's interesting that it's not just that low-income countries have a high prevalence of undernourishment, but also have a whole slew of people who, in fact, have challenges in accessing a healthy diet in the state of Yemen. So, on this kind of moving exactly to this notion of how many can afford a healthy diet, we said that 2 billion people are somewhat food insecure or severely, right? This was a measure from before, but once you start factoring in the costs of a healthy diet, which is a bit different from being food insecure, it's a little bit more ambitious, if you want, because a healthy diet is more than just having the minimum requirements of nutrients. It's also the mix that you have in that diet. What we see in this figure is the average percentage of the population who could not afford a healthy diet. And so I think we see clearly Africa and South Asia are the hotspots, but
Sorry,
it's not.
Catania, can I interrupt you? I'm so sorry. People from the audience told us that they cannot really hear you well.
Oh,
Can you move closer, maybe to the mic?
okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah. So can you hear me better now? I kind of lean like this.
For me, it's clear. Let me just check with the audience if they can write us, if they can.
So I can talk. I need to lean a little bit, but.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
They work. Yes.
Yes. Better
Okay.
now. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay. So just to kind of summarize again, what I was saying is this notion, as we become more ambitious along that ladder that goes from just minimum energy requirements to having a healthy diet, we go from a little bit, 650 million people who are severely food insecure, then you go to 2 billion that are either severely or moderately, and then you go to 3 billion who cannot afford a healthy diet. And what we see is the sub-Saharan Africa, well, not just sub-Saharan Africa, but Africa and South Asia as being hotspots for that, in terms of having many countries, more than 75% of the population does not have access to a healthy diet. That is something that is, I think, quite shocking, frankly. It's when one looks at these numbers. But this is also, when looking around the world, countries that we wouldn't really think of as having major issues when it comes to hunger and food insecurity, once you factor in having a healthy diet, there are countries like Brazil, Mexico, China that have between 10 and 25% of the population that does not have access to a healthy diet in 2017. So again, depending on the indicator you use and the definition you provide of food security and nutrition, you have to tailor the message to a different set of audiences, of countries we see, because the countries that are have severe food insecurity are a more limited number than the ones that instead have issues when it comes to a healthy diet. So I think this is something that is, it affects so many countries throughout the world. Once you think of it more broadly beyond just freedom from hunger, where clearly freedom from hunger is the most urgent, but food affects the lives of everyone in such a way that when we see these numbers about access to a healthy diet, we realize that it's a much broader message, and it's a message that is linked to how we envision the food system working. The global food system, and then obviously individual countries, how food flows and how the expense, the food that people can afford based on the income in the countries. Very often, for those of us who live in high-income countries and have reasonable jobs, food is often not a worry in terms of hunger, and at times it's more a question of having information in terms of what a healthy diet is, since it's a relatively small share of our incomes that we spend, much lower than, for example, in low-income countries. Poor people often spend a large proportion of their income on food, so it's much more challenging. So the notion of kind of thinking about policy options and investments, these must enable this transformation to help reduce the cost of nutritious food and strengthen the purchasing power of the poor, affecting a number of domains. So first of all, kind of rebalancing of agricultural policies and incentives towards more nutrition-sensitive investments. So what type of products, what type of commodities, especially fruits and vegetables, protein-rich plant-based and animal source foods such as legumes, poultry, fish, and dairy products. So it's key to increase productivity in these areas, especially for lower income countries where access to these sources, to these types of foods are often limited. Not so much the case in high income countries where typically it's more a question of having a healthy diet as opposed to not having access at all, for example, plant-based protein. So the policy action across the food supply chains will be critical in reducing these costs of nutritious food, such as action that could enhance efficiencies in storage and processing, and packaging, and distribution, and marketing. So there are many aspects of the food systems that have an impact on this affordability of the diet. Finally, something that is not directly linked to how food is produced, but is linked to safety nets and social protection programs. So thinking about nutrition sensitive social protection programs that are particularly necessary to support the poor and those living through humanitarian crisis without basic access to sufficient nutritious food to meet dietary requirements, and for example, that affects children in a disproportionate way in terms of when they don't have access to nutritious food. So very often, like safety nets will link access to nutritious food for children and their participation in school and try to make a package out of these things. to improve the lives of vulnerable. So, in terms of overall, then, the significant opportunities to address both the health and environmental challenges. I mean, when we think about transforming the food systems to address issues of food security and healthy diets, it really is an overall package to think about dietary patterns with low impact on health and environment, and especially in higher income countries, but also as in middle income countries and increasingly lower income. I mean, the notion of behavioral change, and I think this is something that has already been discussed by previous speakers here, in kind of consumer-oriented policies to think about how how we interact with the food system, and also this notion of healthy diet, about food loss, about food waste, which also is a big part of the debate in how to transform the food system. So these are this is a big picture about how we need to transform the food system to address issues of food security and also diets. So closing this section on food security and nutrition, the message is that really it's urgent action, and that is needed, and it will require changes throughout the food system and beyond, in a sense, because a lot of the challenges that are being faced are also tied to incomes for the poor in low-income countries. Right? So I think that's a big headline message, and it's not particularly surprising, but I think the numbers behind it are surprising. So the magnitude of the problem is something that is worth communicating, and thinking about how to communicate it to different audiences is a big part of what FAO tries to do. So now we move on to food safety, which is a bit of a different topic typically, although food safety and hygiene affect the lives of people worldwide. I mean, they are particularly important in the context of food insecurity. So, because as I mentioned, plays a very key role, because it does affect more of the more vulnerable. I mean, if you do not have access to safe food and hygiene, if on top of that you're also already food insecure in terms of the quantity of food, and your ability to utilize food, as we said, in terms of absorb nutrients, is very effective. So the two are linked. Although food safety is an issue for everybody concerned throughout the world. I mean, even if you are not food insecure and you take care and have access to a healthy diet, food safety in terms of how food comes from the field to the table in that process is key to everyone in terms of how we live our lives. So, first of all, as I did for food security, the definition of food safety, right? Food safety is the absence or safe acceptable levels of hazards in food that may be consumed without harm for the health of consumers over the lifetime. So again, this is, I think, a pretty shorter than food security as definitions go, but it does highlight that it's a complex issue, right? I mean, some things should not be at all in food. Others are safe, and we don't have to worry about how much there is. And others, instead, I mean, we will have to think about what is an acceptable level, so that as we eat food over our lifetime, we're not affected negatively. Right? And this is a huge deal, right? Because in 2004, I mean, the UN, the 160 countries voted to make food a human right. And here, I mean, it's safe food, right? So we see, however, that the risks to safety continue with many challenges, I mean, throughout the world. In high-income countries, very often we have a very elaborate system of control. Increasingly, this is available elsewhere. There are international standards, but there's still a lot to do, and a lot of people that are affected by unsafe food. And here, just to give you a sense, again, of the magnitude of the problem in terms of you have more than 200 diseases that can be caused by unsafe food. And you have 600 million cases of foodborne illnesses and 420,000 deaths as a result of contaminated food. And it can be bacteria, it can be viruses, it can be parasites, toxins, chemicals. So the hazards are multiple, and each one requires a different set of measures, a different set of information to reach different audiences. Again, the issue of communication. So the loss of healthy life, I mean, it's, again, to give a sense of magnitude, it's comparable to major infectious diseases, such as HIV, malaria, tuberculosis. So the issue of food safety, something that very often we give for granted when food comes to our table, is in fact a huge issue around the world. And also, it has an strikingly unequal impact on public health. Children are the most affected. They bear the 40% of the global burden of food-related diseases, even though they represent only a much smaller part of the population, 9%. And as I was saying in my transition to the food safety, people in developing regions are the most affected. So over 70% of the global burden of foodborne diseases is in developing countries. So again, a major issue linked to the food system and how we handle food that affects the lives of millions of people. Now, as I was saying, I mean, the foodborne hazards can be microbiological, chemical, or physical in nature, and often, they're often not visible to the plain eye. I mean, think about bacteria, viruses, chemicals that can be residues in the food that comes to our table. So, the Codex Alimentarius is a key collection of internationally recognized standards, codes of practice, and guidelines and recommendations relating to both foods, food production, and food safety. So this is the international reference that sets the standards for all these different issues linked to either microorganisms in food or chemical hazards. And so starting with microorganisms, right? These must be controlled along the whole food chain. Now, some microorganisms are in fact part of producing food, right? I mean, if you think about yogurt, cheese, a number of things that are, those are microorganisms that are supposed to be in the food for their very characteristics. But there are a whole slew of other microorganisms that are not supposed to be in the food. And so one has to think about how to monitor these and make sure that the food that reaches the consumer is in fact safe from a microbiological perspective. So, clearly the three approaches that are combined is like preventing the introduction of microorganisms into the food. So this is food safety measures that during the primary production and so the very initial phases, but also throughout the processing, right? That can happen. You can also inactivate microorganisms in foods, for example, I mean, through pasteurizing milk, sterilizing, and finally by inhibiting the growth of microorganisms. And this is, for example, the modified atmosphere that we have in packaging when we buy stuff in supermarkets, or having the cold chain be guaranteed throughout the life of the product, from when it's produced, processed, and then makes it to the supermarket, that it's the cold chain is never broken, right? Because that's when microorganisms can flourish. So regulatory authorities have set microbiological safety limits. Again, these are often linked to the Codex Alimentarius, but they are then specified at a national level to define, and these define the distinction between food that is acceptable and unacceptable. It's along the food value chain. Now, in practical terms, one can do microbiological testing, but it takes time, it takes money. So, in practical purposes, for along many supply chains, the safety of food is principally assured by applying good management practices. So, good hygienic practices in conjunction with hazard analysis, like critical control points, right? Sampling, and so that is a central element of how we fight against microorganisms that can be harmful in our food. Then there is the chemical side, right? And chemical hazards in terms of substances that can enter foods at the different stages along the food chain. So different types of chemical substances can come in for different reasons. I mean, obviously you have drugs that were given to animals, so veterinary drugs. You have pesticides. So these are things that typically occur at the primary level of production, the farm level, and then, however, carry over through all the way to the consumer. There can be additives used during processing, which can help in conservation. They can help with a number of things, but they have to be monitored. Chemicals from food contact materials that can be carried over to foods, so from packaging, for example. Environmental contaminants of natural or man-made origin. Think about heavy metals, for example, mercury. So all these need to be monitored, right? And they need to be tracked so that we make sure that our food supply is safe. On top of that, there are also situations where chemicals are added illegally, right? So that's an extra layer of attention that has to be paid because, for example, cases of the past of melamine milk to increase the protein level of that milk, but it's something that is a chemical hazard, right? So just to kind of give a visual representation, and then looking at the maize value chain, right? We see how all the different entry points where you can have different hazards come in. So pesticides and fertilizers starting off with, but fungus like mycotoxins due to bad drying and storage practices. For example, with corn, with maize, it's aflatoxin, and that is can consumed in a recurrent way. Aflatoxin can have negative health consequences. Then also at the kind of milling and transport, you can have situations where food is packaged in recycled bags, right? So the example here is packaging food in what was used for fertilizer bags. Clearly not something that's going to happen. And then as you process and as it comes to the consumer, the use of additives. What additives in what amount? That's also something that needs to be tracked, right? Now, the controlling the use of chemicals in primary production and processing is clearly a very important part of guaranteeing food safety. So the general guidance is that only permitted chemicals should be used, and these need to be governed by good practices as established by authorities, be they international guidelines or regulation, legislation at the national level. The amount and type of chemicals also has to be monitored. And also, you need to implement programs so that final products only contain acceptable level of residue. So one has to have a mechanism in place to test and make sure that, in fact, for those allowed chemicals, the amount that one finds when one buys something at the market or at the supermarket is indeed acceptable based on national regulation and international standards. And it's the same with the use of additives, right? Where we need to monitor the quantity, because these do have raison d'etre, a reason why they're there. I mean, it's as I mentioned before, it's preventing the growth of microorganisms, but it might be also to improve texture or flavor, and so, however, guidelines must be followed there too. So where do these guidelines come in? And here is where I was started off my presentation saying about the Codex Alimentarius and how it kind of defines these international standards. This is something that one can access online, and clearly it's important especially for people who work along the food value chain to have a sense of what standards need to be respected. And so, for example, I mentioned veterinary drugs in terms of minimum, maximum residue levels and pesticides. So one can access, if you're a food processor, if you're a primary producer, you can actually access this, or somebody on the behalf of cooperatives or associations to check. And again, I mean, this is a very specific type of information that needs to be communicated to a very specific audience. So very different, if you want, from the food security presentation of the first part of the presentation, where it's a much broader audience, and this is instead targeted to people who operate in the food system. And similarly for the food additives, again, the Codex Alimentarius has guidance on food additives, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and furthermore on the quantities that are allowed. So, and again, this is available online, and the Codex Alimentarius is a collaboration between FAO and the World Health Organization, two organizations that are very much in charge of this dimension of food safety that is so important to our health. So, and again, communication products that support the identification of these risks are important for businesses, because it's complicated for a small business to know all the rules and regulations. So very often also producing the material in a way that is accessible, such as, for example, data sheets that are available online on something like MSG, something that one finds a lot in processed food, for example, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, so that people who work in the sector can follow kind of guidance and respect regulations. So here I'm kind of coming to a little bit to the conclusion of the presentation and trying to think a little bit more out loud about communication aspects, right? And ranging from food security to nutrition to food safety, I think what emerges is the needs to be communicated to different audiences. And in fact, even food security that I presented as a very kind of global issue, FAO has offices all over the world, and especially active in low-income countries, where, if you want, the audiences are in fact the people who are food insecure. I mean, there are projects. So how do you reach these people directly? So it's not about the big numbers, but it's about communicating possibilities and options or changes that can be made to improve people's conditions. So again, I mean, there's a whole broad spectrum of how you communicate this information and to what audiences. So to carry out its mission, I mean, FAO's communication strategy has evolved dramatically in recent years. I would say specifically in the last 10 years, but it has been over time, I think, evolving quite significantly. Now, one example, right, is on the upper left-hand side is in white is the cover of the State of Food and Agriculture in 1947. This was actually the first report produced by the United Nations, and coming out of the Second World War, and detailing the state of agriculture in the world and coming out of a major crisis. And this was a report that was about 20 pages, and clearly there was no communication. You had to go to a library to find it, and things have evolved quite dramatically since then. And so we see even just the graphics, the way they evolved. I mean, on the small ones are different covers of the state of food and agriculture going up to the 1990s, but also what was the original flagship of FAO, the State of Food and Agriculture, spawned 4 other important periodic reports that are flagships that cover thematic areas. So there's now one on forestry, there's one on fisheries, there's one on commodities, and then there is the one that I was focusing on the first part of my presentation, which is the state of food security and nutrition in the world, or SOFI, right? And here in my next slide, I think I want to get to something that is quite new to me, because it's something that FAO started doing just this year. But this is something, this is how FAO tracks the impact of this report. And this is something that was introduced this year for the flagships. It's called an ALT metric. And where you see that little donut, right, on the upper left with a number inside, that is, in a sense, a measure of the impact of the report. So the number at the center of the donut says it's kind of a relative number, right? I mean, a publication can have a score of 0, or it can have a score of whatever, 10,000. But let's say 2,000 and plus is a very, very high impact, right? I mean, I was reading that the ALT metric is essentially a company that tracks publications in terms of where they are cited, right? And it tracks for news outlets, it tracks blogs, it tracks policy sources, tweets, right? If in a tweet there's a link to specific to this report, it'll get picked up. But it even tracks Wikipedia pages, Reddit, videos, so things pop up on YouTube, and so it's very broad. So if one thinks about the evolution of how these reports function, that you just had the report and it was put out, and you had to go to the library and read it. Now the different media platforms that are offered to reports like this, but to any publication, in fact, is in fact quite incredible. I mean, something that 20 years ago was really not on the horizon yet. And but it also so it's great because for FAO, I mean, we can think about how to communicate this information that's contained in this report or in other reports, and but it is also, and it's a way of also being able to think about impact, because institutions like FAO, but also other institutions around the world that have projects or that produce knowledge, even universities, they are being asked more and more to prove that they have an impact, which means that communicating is becoming more and more important for all these institutions, and how you communicate. So it's not just a question of putting out the report, but it is about how you end up reaching as many outlets and as many people as possible, and the people you want to reach, your audience, your intended audience. And so just to give you an idea, just in 2020, I checked the number of publications that come up in Google Scholar that focus on food and agriculture are like 200,000. 200,000 publications just in 1 year that talk about food and agriculture. And so how do you come out on top? How do you come out in those first 4 or 5 pages of the Google Scholar search or of the search engine search if you want to get your message out? And that is, I think the SOFI is a very successful example of that. I mean, I think having policy sources, which means actual policy documents that can be from the European Parliament, or they can be legislation that cites the report as something that is important to that policy document. I think is quite an accomplishment. And it also makes us think about how we can reach out to a broader set of people. You can even see, for example, through this altmetric, where in the world people are interacting with the report. So the tweets, it will tell you by country where the tweets are coming from. So are people in developing countries and low-income countries looking at this report? We can find out, right? And the same thing in terms of the news outlets. It will report news outlets in all around the world in multiple languages. And so this is just as a reflection on how we communicate results. Now, one of the things I think that stands out is that the Codex Alimentarius is a completely different type of product, right? I mean, it's not a product necessarily that is meant to reach through many different media platforms as much as it needs to reach the right people who are actors, people who work in the food system. So, and also consumers to the extent that they want to be informed. But in terms of guaranteeing food safety, I mean, really the information has to get to the people who work along the food value chain. And finally, as I was saying, major changes have been occurring also in the field, right? So I presented only kind of a big picture on food security and nutrition, but in fact, FAO has many projects in the countries, and how you communicate in the countries has changed compared to 20 years ago. For example, the number of people who have cell phones, smartphones, or even old-style cell phones, and you can reach them now with targeted messages based on where they live or other information that we have. So that again is it's a major change in terms of how we used to communicate. Which you might have a radio program that periodically would inform farmers on what's best to do. But that would be transmitted at a national level, so it's not targeted to your local conditions. Nowadays, you can actually do that. So thinking about communication, which is people in the audience know much more about it than I do. I mean, I'm not a specialist in communication, but each of these different dimensions of knowledge and of creating knowledge really tie in to essentially thinking about how to communicate, how to reach the audience that matters when it comes to getting that message out there. And on that note, I thank you all, and I guess we can move on to the set of questions, which I can now look at here. So I just, oops, that's a little bit, sorry. Okay. Just a second. So let me start. See that. So I'll just take the questions in order, the way I see them here. Do you think that consumption of insects can help food security in the future? Well, I mean, this raises an interesting issue because very often what is considered a healthy diet is also linked very much to culture. Right? So there are cultures where eating insects is in fact considered a very good source of protein and is culturally quite normal, and cultures where it's less of a custom. So I think in terms of addressing food security, we saw these different dimensions of food security and how they it's about a healthy diet, and a lot of it is linked, in fact, to income, right? And having a diversity of foods, fruits and vegetables, and sources of protein, be they plant-based or not. So I think the short answer is insects could be part of the solution in those cultures where it's accepted, and I think as it's been known for quite some time that they are a very good source of protein. So next question is, what is the difference between food security and food safety? Well, this is actually, it's a very good question also because in some languages, I mean, the two are really the same thing. And so it can lead to quite a bit of confusion. So food security is, if you want, a situation of people have, individuals, right, in terms of, as I mentioned, having access to safe food, right? So I think food safety is an element within the broader concept of food security. So you can have safe food available in your country, but you might not have access to it. So you are food insecure, even though there is safe food in the country. Or in fact, I mean, you might be food insecure because, in fact, because of hygienic conditions in terms of food processing. In fact, you're buying food, but it's not safe. So the two are linked. I would say food security is a broader concept and is one that is much more tied to what the livelihoods and the incomes and the overall situation of individuals. Food safety is very much linked to the individual product that is either safe or not, and the value chain that brings it to the final consumer. How can we be protected? Moving on to the next question. Sorry. How can we be protected from illegal additives as consumers? That is essentially something that is very much up to the authorities, because in terms of doing random checks of products, because things that are illegal by their very nature, I mean, they're not going to appear on labels, right? So there's a big part of food safety that is based on the labeling, right? So, for example, labeling nowadays always has whether there's a risk of peanuts or allergens having come into contact with that food, even though it's not contained. So that's the kind of stuff that you see on labeling. When it comes to illegal additives, it's clearly in the kind of the monitoring that is put in place by the authorities and the penalties involved, clearly, because it's also a question of if you get caught, what happens to you. But those are two important elements. So in terms of individuals, clearly it's lobbying for this type of better legislation and monitoring in those countries where it's an issue. I mean, because unfortunately in many countries, illegal activities are quite limited. Even though, I mean, even in developed countries, I mean, I know in Italy, periodically listening at the news, I mean, you do hear about the police having found products that were adulterated with things that should not be in there. So it's something that needs to be monitored, yes. But it is very much in the hands of law enforcement. Another question. Is there anything we can do personally through our habits in order to make hunger be eliminated? Well, I think there are multiple things that we can do. I think some are more local in a sense. I mean, I think, for example, I mean, food banks are very much kind of growing, not just something that has been traditional in richer countries, but also we're now seeing in countries in the Middle East, but also in Brazil. I mean, food banks being something that is more and more um, uh, common in terms of kind of meeting the needs of the vulnerable. And so, donating to food banks, whether this is clearly something for restaurants, facilitating this type of donation, some of the examples that the EU is now trying to make easier, right? Because at times, because of legislation, I mean, it's restaurants or supermarkets find it difficult to donate food to food banks. So, but I think whether as a company, as a restaurant, or as an individual, donating food to food banks is one kind of easy local way of kind of thinking about how to reduce hunger. In the bigger scheme of things, right? I think it's there are losses along the food value chain, and to the extent that authorities at the kind of the public sector and the private sector manage to reduce these losses, right? Then food becomes more affordable, right? Because there's more food on the market, and so prices will be a little bit lower. And this means that it gets a little bit to this notion of the affordability of the diet, and things like, for example, fresh fruits and vegetables, reducing the losses along the value chain is also something that can, in fact, make it easier for poor people to have access to more fruits and vegetables. So that is kind of overall in terms of linking it directly to food loss and waste. And I think those are kind of probably the things that come to mind right off the top of my head. Moving on to the next question. Sorry. We have to do much also in the Western world, since many people here are obese or oversized. Will education be sufficient to convince new generations to change their lifestyle? This is actually a very good point. That that final step in that ladder that I was presenting is in fact about healthy diets, which is not just about getting the nutrients, but having the right mix and avoiding obesity, which is a growing problem in all regions of the world, all income levels. It's all country income levels. Right? So it's a problem that is growing. I think behavioral change is clearly what is required. It's cultural, and in many cultures, even being a little bit say overweight is seen as a sign of wealth, and so it's something that changing that perspective from kind of one where it's about having enough food to having quality food and a quality diet that kind of avoids the increasing burden of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, like heart attacks, and stuff like that. So, will education be sufficient? I think the answer is over time it will have to be linked to education. And I think what we're seeing in countries is that as, let's say, the higher the level of education of the population at large, the higher the conscience, the understanding of what it means to have a healthy diet. And this is something that is seen also. I think there are studies that show that this is the case. It's happening, for example, in China. It's happening in other countries. So I think there is reason to be optimistic, but I think there's also it's a long path before we get there. Because I think for many countries, we're still really thinking about how to even get enough food and enough nutrients to people. So that will come in, I think, at a later stage. Next question. Which products are more dangerous and where do we need to have more attention? So I assume that this is kind of in the food safety category. I'm not really a food safety expert. I would say it depends a lot on where you live. So I would say that in a high-income country, probably the most likely risk is it's a low risk, but it can happen that the cold chain might have been interrupted. Checks are pretty detailed. So in terms of the kind of illegal products circulating freely in the system, I think it's unlikely. And regulations are also more stringent. So in some countries, products that might be illegal, for example, in a country like I don't know, like Egypt, might be legal somewhere else, right? In our country. So in a sense, it depends on what the baseline is for the regulation, because there's no the Codex Alimentarius provides an international standard, but essentially it's a guideline, right? And then it's each country sets their own limits for things, and for residues and for additives and stuff like that. So I think it is very context dependent. I think in many countries the food system is relatively safe, but as we saw, I mean, in terms of the 70% of issues linked to foodborne illnesses are in developing countries. So that's probably my answer to that in terms of it's not maybe a specific product, but it's depending on where you live and knowing what products come into your diet, what you might have to be more careful about based on how the cold chain functions and how the controls, how the kind of the general sense of how food is regulated in that country. And now, going on to the next question. My question is, what can we do for desert areas, arid countries such as like United Arab Emirates and Qatar, and can supply food to themselves while their neighbors suffering from hunger, especially Yemen, Chad, and Zambia? Well, trying to understand just the context of the question. I mean, for sure, I mean, in high-income countries like United Arab Emirates and Qatar, I mean, it's although there's always a debate about self-sufficiency, but I think there's by now I think an agreement that high-income countries can always procure foods through imports, and then some production maybe within the domestic borders. But it's in terms of helping neighbors suffering from hunger, I think that is, I mean, there's the immediate addressing of hunger, something like, for example, the World Food Program deals with acute crisis in terms of bringing food in situations of crisis where there's a high prevalence of undernourishment. So, I mean, that type of intervention is important. And then there's a longer term development. I mean, thinking about, okay, why is it that certain population is food secure? And that is a longer term vision of it that needs to be taken by countries that are, let's say, already high income in terms of how to help countries where these problems are still very present. I have a question. In terms of food recipients, which material is the safest one to use and the best quality and less expensive at the same time? So which one we could use much more in the future? Um, I'm not sure I understand the question full. I guess in terms of what types of foods are the safest. Um, Again, I think it depends a lot on the context. Right? It's in a country where the cold chain is not guaranteed, for example, you might be inclined to avoid certain types of food, such as fish, right? Which is typically it's a healthy product, but if the cold chain is not guaranteed. So it very much depends on the context. I think one can safely say that raw vegetables and fruit, I think, are typically very safe as long as they are washed thoroughly with clean clean water. Spoilage, which is one form of microorganism impact on fruits and vegetables, is something that lowers the quality of food. And so we think of it as a food safety danger, but in some respects, if you want, it's less dangerous than of fish or meat or cheese. But again, I mean, I think it very much depends on the context of where one buys food and the country. I have a thought on what are my thoughts on GMO foods and are they hazardous to our health? Now, here, frankly, I'll admit I'm not an expert on GMO foods. I think FAO does not have a firm position on them. Research in terms of being hazardous to our health, what I have seen in terms of scientific research is that in principle they are not hazardous to the health. Again, I'm not an expert on this topic, so I do think that it's good to have labeling, right? So consumers can choose and whether the product is GMO or not. And there is a debate on on the affordability of some foods and the fact that GMO does make some products more affordable. So in this debate, I don't have a clear line of conclusion in terms of foods. Next question, let's see. In the Western countries are used to eat vegetables and fruits that are not local or typical of the season. This is a bit of a part of a question, but I'm not sure. I guess it's eating fruits and vegetables that are out of season. This is something I always advise to eat things that are seasoned, that are local. That's out of just kind of personal awareness of transporting food. But we do live in a period where there's a lot of trade of different products. And so it is a possibility to buy strawberries in the winter because they come from a faraway country. In terms of food safety, I mean, these follow the same lines and follow the same regulations of food produced locally. So in a sense, it's not an issue. It's more an issue of if you want environmental impact of that food. And so it's more of an issue of personal choice. I think in just about any country, you can have a diverse diet without importing strawberries out of season. So it kind of it's a consumer choice. So again, it gets back to education and how you communicate the best way of having a healthy diet. So how does COVID? This is a very interesting question. How does COVID-19 contribute to food insecurity? Now, when COVID-19 first first appeared as a full-fledged pandemic, there was a lot of concern about food supply and about, is food going to arrive to consumers? And that concern turned out to be unfounded. And I think the food systems in many countries proved to be quite resilient in terms of the production continued and exemptions were made so that the food could be brought to market. It was difficult, but it was done. Where it had a major effect on food insecurity, and that's the estimate that is coming out about 132 million who became food insecure, is because with the lockdowns, many people no longer had an income, especially if you're employed informally on a day-to-day basis, as is the case in many kind of low-income countries. All of a sudden, you no longer have an income. Therefore, you no longer have money to buy food, and that's something that happened in many, many countries. So there, it depends what type of safety net is in place in the country, but it's that has been the main impact on food security, has been through the reduced incomes of people linked to the disruption in the economy overall. I mean, how it disrupted services, how it disrupted many other activities, and therefore, income. I think that was the last of the questions. Yes. I don't know if Paola does. We have a little bit more time. I don't know, Paola, if.
Hello. Okay, so here I am.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. We had a lot of questions. I don't know if you want to use these last minutes to add something. Otherwise, I have some quick notes for the end of this section, but I will leave you the floor to you for the conclusion.
You have quick notes, meaning you want to talk, I mean, you're welcome to.
Okay, so I just want to remind our audience that tomorrow in the afternoon, we are going to close this winter school with a closing section that will involve our speakers. And if you want, you can send us other questions or comments or topics you want to address to our guests. So you will receive an email tomorrow morning with the new link for the section of the afternoon, because we had to change it. So please take a look at your email tomorrow morning. And nothing, that's all. Let's see you tomorrow, of course, in the morning with the next lessons, and then in the afternoon for the closing one.
Okay. Thank you very much.